I'm Tamara. I'm going to make a few of these videos to kind of give you some basic tips and tricks to kind of really bring the game for the gingerbread contest, because we want people to really kick some butt with this. And one of the first things you have to do with gingerbread is stop and think about what you're going to do. Is it going to be a house? Is it going to be some other kind of building? Is it even going to be a building? Because one of the best gingerbread pieces I ever saw was just a table and chairs with some characters in it. It was little reindeers playing poker, and it came in third in the national contest, and it was amazing. If you are going to do a house, think about who lives there. What kind of house is it? Are they like the sort of folks that make everything sickeningly twee? Like they think they're unicorns or something? Are they actual unicorns? Because one of my houses I did, it was actually a house for unicorns, and it was adorable. But so I brought also these little barn touches to it. But once you've kind of thought about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, then you have to start planning the actual house. And if you've already bought a pre-done kit and you don't have to worry about the dimensions of your walls and stuff, you don't really necessarily have to worry about this part. That if you're going to make your own out of thin air and you're not going to use a pre-done template or anything, then you have to think about all your dimensions and proportions. And this is all my super fancy planning equipment that I use. And this was actually the template for my very first thing that I did without any plans or pre-made kits. And I just plopped it down on there, cut around it, and went on. It was fine. You did it like this for the sides, and then stood it up and cut the angle in for the roof pitch. And I didn't have to worry about the angles being square. Everything was nice and crisp. I didn't have to worry about it. It was easy. You also need to think about what you're going to build on, because you want this thing to be mobile, but you want it to be sturdy. And you can use plywood. I would use at least 1/4 inch, probably 1/2 inch. But that can get a little pricey even in small pieces. So I like styrofoam. This is my super fancy cake board that it's just a panel of styrofoam out of a package we got at work. Wrapped it in a little paper, and now it looks like I really did something nice. And if you wanted to use colored paper or something like that, that would really look like you had done something fancy. I like to have something with a nice square angle on it. You don't have to have a T-square. I finally invested in one this year because I got sick of measuring up on everything and marking and then trying to draw across it with a regular ruler. And it was just much easier that way. When you make your templates, wrap them in a little bit of basic packing tape, because then instead of having just some little cardboard that will stick to your dough, believe me, then you have something that even if it does stick, you can just wipe it off instead of having to sit there and chisel off bits of dry dough with your finger. And that makes your templates much sturdier and easier to reuse for next year. Which this one actually is a template that I made for a demo last year. And I have just decided to repurpose it, because if you're going to go to that kind of trouble, you might as well make it worthwhile. Once you get kind of your dimensions and proportions and everything the way you really think you want it, get everything out of poster board, or I've used pop cartons, or just anything that will stand up. Tape all your pieces together, just so that they'll hinge a little bit. Kind of lay it out on the base that you plan on doing, and make sure everything fits together. If you're doing something that has completed walls and a roof, make sure that your roof panels actually reach all the way down, because I have done that before and cut the same piece too short like 5 times. I only just used a piece of cardboard on it and taped some cookies on top and called it good. But make sure that everything sits flush in the way you want it, and that you like the way the proportions sit. And I have revamped this one several times and been like, that window seems a little tall. That little, table seems really high compared to that counter. Okay, that Christmas tree is just way too big for that space. And, tinker with it, because it's going to be much easier to work with poster board than it is with gingerbread. Get it kind of laid out the way you truly think you want it. For inside things, you get I couldn't find an X-Acto knife when I was cutting this out, and so I need to go back and re-neaten it. But I just poked a hole in it and cut it out with scissors. But the more precise you can be with your template, the better everything's going to fit, and the less bad words you're going to need to say later on. Believe me, I've been there and done that many, many, many times. And once you've figured out kind of, what you want to do, just take these pieces, flip the tape over them, plop them straight on your gingerbread, cut around them. We will do that with one of the other templates here in just a second. But that's really all there is to making a template for your gingerbread house. I mean, you can make it a lot more complicated than that, but that's all it needs to be. And we've got there are a ton of different recipes for construction gingerbread. We've got one in a file that we have sent you guys when you registered. And you can also find a ton of them online. The major difference between construction gingerbread and, say, regular eating gingerbread is that it has no leavening in it, because leavening is going to make it puff up and spread. And it's also going to make it weak, so it's more likely to buckle when you put stuff on it. And trust me, I have fallen into that trap many times too. That this, if you would believe it, all of these doughs are the exact same recipe. This is the only one that has any food coloring in it. The difference between this and this is this one, the recipe calls for cinnamon and cloves, and I put them in. And in this one I didn't, so you get a much blonder gingerbread. So if you want something that you're going to color the whole dough, or you just want it to be really pale, that would be the way to go. But you do have to still use either brown sugar or molasses, and you still have to use ginger. Otherwise, it doesn't count as gingerbread. And strict contests, they really check that kind of stuff. And you want it to have so much flour and so much kneading that it is just like Play-Doh. So if you never make cookies at home because they always come out really tough and chewy and they hurt your mouth to eat them, you're perfect for making gingerbread, because that's what you want when you're building with it. And since I have little bits and blobs of everything, I'm gonna try to make a marbled gingerbread. And that's something that a lot of people use as a technique to get like cool effects. If you've ever gone through and looked at the pictures from like some of these, hardcore gingerbread competitions, they have so many cool things like that. And always make sure that everything is well floured. And I like to put just a little bit of cornstarch in with the flour. It seems like it makes everything kind of smooth out a little easier. And you get a little more motion when you try to knead. Which, if you're trying to really get things mixed together, is kind of what you want, to be able to just kind of do that deal with it. And when you're going to, actually let's back up a little bit before we start rolling things out and talk about getting your stuff to not stick and being able to move your pieces without completely destroying the shape of them. I like parchment paper. It's fairly inexpensive, it's easy to get. It comes in these pre-cut pieces that if you have a half sheet pan sized cookie tray, which is pretty standard, I think, for a cookie tray, fits in there perfectly, just like it was made for it, because it was. And then you can just kind of use that to move everything, and it makes life easier. I also like to flour the actual parchment paper. It's non-stick, so it's not to keep everything from sticking. It's just that sometimes when I roll things out and you don't have a little bit of flour on there, you get all these weird little bubbles and stuff in the paper. And then when you go to do the underside of your gingerbread, you get all these weird bubbles baked into it, and it looks funky. Flour the top of it, because that also helps it slide and spread along the one you're going to put on top. Mesh it kind of roughly flat. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then roll it out. I like to use these fancy little roller pin guides that I got for Christmas several years ago. They come in different sizes and you pick which thickness you want to use. So then you get everything much more even. And you're not sitting there with a ruler like, is that it? Because I have no time for that. You'll have no time for that. And then see how much more easily that is spreading across rather than buckling and humping everywhere. And see those nice little streaks we're getting through it? Well, you can't really see them all that well. Once the flour comes off there a little more, you'll see it much more easily. And if you don't have little rolling pin guides, you can actually kind of make your own. See how easily that picked up rather than trying to stick to everything and how flat that is? That's what you want, because you ideally want the back of your gingerbread to be just as pretty as the front. But to control the thickness of your stuff, and you're typically aiming for about 1/4 inch for walls and roofs, you can grab some of those paint spray sticks that they have at the hardware store, set them on either side of what you're doing, and they'll make little rails for your rolling pin. And that's going to be bigger than my parchment in some places, and that's fine. Make sure that what you're doing fits. Ideally, try to fit a couple of pieces in at once if you can. Almost. And I am not above, chiseling a little bit here and there to make everything fit. And then there are several different tools that you can use. My personal favorite is the pizza wheel. But you can also use just a paring knife if you have a bench scraper, which if you don't and you bake any at all, I deeply recommend that you get something like this, because when sometimes you don't flour things enough, and those sticks, you're trying to scrape it off of your hand. Slide that up under there. It's also good for scooping up little bits and pieces of stuff. And you can also use the edge of it as a nice straight cutting edge for your gingerbread. But my personal preference is for this guy. At least in places that I'm not going to have big, giant, or little tiny bits and pieces that I'm trying to get into. Like, I would not try to use that for these cutouts here, because that's just crazy tall. And yeah, I should have floured that just a little more. because it's wanting to stick. And then if you can butt your pieces up against each other, just even if it's just part of the line there, that's going to be that much less cutting you have to do. And also, if you have a little rim of dough around the edge of a piece, it's going to be less likely to spread on your edges. We've got, that almost gives a camel effect. That's awesome. That is completely unintentional also. And double check and make sure you cut out everything that you plan to cut out, because if you don't cut it now, you're sure not going to be able to cut it later. Let's say if I wanted to put a little opening here, and if you want things to be kind of rustic and freeform, you can totally do it this way. If not, you can totally make cutouts in your template and cut around them. But I feel like living dangerously today. And then I'm going to leave just a little rim around this cutout. And that did not tear very cleanly, but that's okay, because that is not a part of my actual piece. That's just a little protection border for everything. And as something to butt up against. When things bake, they naturally want to spread just a little bit. And it's kind of like when you're sitting in the airplane seat. There's nobody beside you, you're just kind of like, when there's somebody else beside you, you're like, okay, fine. And baked goods are just kind of the same way. If there's something there beside it, it's not going to want to warp over quite so much for you. And you don't have to do it that way. I have just found that it's easier, and it saves me a lot of neatening up edges later. And if you happen to make a little divot that you didn't intend, just smooth it out with your finger. It'll be fine. And even with this, a lot of times things still spread just a little bit. So you have to go back through and neaten things up after it's baked. And ideally, you don't drop everything you own. Okay, so then the question becomes, how do we get this bad boy on the pan without distorting it? Because if I try to pick it up like this, it's going to stretch and get all kinds of out of shape. Because see how it's already wanting to do that? And if you do accidentally bump something out of shape, just put it back in with your hand. So what I like to do, and I like to use the back of the pan, because if you try to do it this way, coming up over the lip, you're more likely to distort things. And also the airflow in your oven is not going to be as even because you've got this little windbreak right here. So it's not going to bake as evenly for you. So this is the beauty of the parchment pan, or the parchment paper. Just slide that bad boy on like that. Give it one last check to make sure everything's kind of smooth and the way you want it. And pop it into the oven. And those tend to take a lot longer than you think they will. I typically start checking on walls about 15 minutes. And usually at 15 minutes, it's kind of at an eating cookie consistency. So you want to cook it several more minutes past that. You want it to be like this. And this is not the recommended way to store your stuff. if you can't do that with your building gingerbread, your building's not gonna stay up all of the time. I mean, it is hard as a rock.